I was replaced in under 60 seconds after 14 years of building the very system they were about to break. They called it a leadership decision. I called it the moment everything began to collapse. Because the man Tucker Brantley, CEO of Brantley Group, chose his nephew was about to touch a contract he didn't understand. And when it finally hit him, what he had done, it would already be too late. My name is Calla Price, Senior Deal Strategist. For 14 years, I designed the structures behind the company's most sensitive deals, the invisible framework that kept risk contained and outcomes controlled. The $140 million transaction on the table that morning wasn't just another deal. It was precision. Legal triggers, compliance safeguards, layered approvals, every line calibrated. Then Tucker spoke. My nephew will take the lead from here. Shock doesn't explode. It settles. Dylan Brantley walked in like applause should follow him, designer suit, effortless grin, casually texting his girlfriend and smirking at her replies in the middle of the meeting. He didn't even pretend to focus on the contract before taking my seat. I'll drive this, he said, still glancing at his phone. I was repositioned. Support, Tucker added, like that word could rewrite 14 years. Humiliation has a temperature. Cold. Dylan leaned back, angled his phone, and whispered, "Watch this, not to us, but to someone on the other end." The full contract was projected behind him, every number, every clause, every safeguard I had built over months. No one stopped him. I didn't either. Stillness when chosen is power. He flipped through the pages too quickly. "This is over-engineered," he muttered, already bored. Then he picked up a pen, and without understanding what he was touching, he crossed out a single line. Just one, and in that exact second, I understood something no one else in that room did. He hadn't simplified the deal, he had just triggered the system. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you find this story engaging. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I would also like to make a small note. This is a fictional story based on real-life experiences and situations in my profession, with some elements created using artificial intelligence to make the story more vivid. I hope it leaves a lasting impression and provides you with an enjoyable experience. I didn't argue after the meeting. I didn't need to. The silence I carried out of that room felt heavier than anything I could have said. For 14 years, I had been the one they called when deals started to fracture under pressure. I stabilized a $90 million acquisition overnight when legal conflicts surfaced hours before signing. I rebuilt a collapsing cross-border contract that would have cost the company over $27 million in penalties if it failed compliance review. Quietly, consistently, I designed the internal safeguards that no one noticed until something went wrong, and suddenly, everything depended on them. That was my role. Invisible, critical, replaceable apparently. Dylan's role was visibility. I had seen his name before the meeting, though never attached to anything that held weight. There was the incident at a private party, an internal file casually shown to impress the wrong audience, brushed off as a misunderstanding. There were expense reports that looked more like lifestyle statements. And there was always Tucker Brantley, CEO, standing just behind him, smoothing everything over with a practiced calm. He just needs exposure, Tucker had said once, as if responsibility could be learned through proximity instead of consequence. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was structural. Dylan didn't build systems. He moved through them assuming they would hold because someone else had made them strong enough to survive him. As I replayed the meeting in my head, one moment stayed sharper than the rest. The way he leaned back in my chair, glanced at me with that easy confidence, and said almost casually, "You build things." I closed them. I remember the room going quiet after that, not because it was impressive, but because no one corrected him. And I didn't either. Not because he was right, but because I understood something he didn't. Every system I had built had limits, boundaries, conditions that didn't negotiate with confidence or last names. They responded to actions, precisely, automatically. And somewhere in that contract, somewhere between his impatience and his need to prove himself, he had already crossed one of them. I didn't feel anger, not even resentment, just a steady, controlled awareness. Because I knew exactly what would happen next. The system doesn't punish people, it locks them out. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask for an explanation. I simply closed my laptop, nodded once, and walked out of the room like nothing had been taken from me. Restraint isn't weakness, it's timing. Back at my desk, everything looked exactly the same: 2 monitors, a half-finished compliance review, the contract still open in a secured window. The same system I had spent years refining was still running, still precise, still indifferent to titles and last names. I opened a new email. Short, direct, professional. Effective immediately. I am resigning from my position as senior deal strategist. No emotion, no justification, just a timestamp. I hit send and watched the message disappear into the same network I had helped stabilize for over a decade. For a moment, nothing moved. No alarms, no reaction, just quiet. Then I checked the clock. Under company policy, access privileges don't terminate instantly. There's a controlled offboarding window, 24 hours, sometimes less, depending on urgency, but never immediate. It's designed to ensure continuity to prevent abrupt system gaps. I designed that protocol, which meant for a limited time, I was still inside. Calculation is rarely dramatic, it's precise. I pulled up the contract Dylan had just modified. The system had already logged his changes, time-stamped version traceable. Every action leaves a footprint. That was intentional. Accountability isn't optional in structures like this. It's embedded. I didn't reverse anything. I didn't interfere. I simply selected one field. Verification status. The contract had been approved earlier under my credentials, fully compliant, fully aligned. But now, after his edits, that approval no longer applied. The system required a revalidation step 1 most people didn't even know existed because it was automatically triggered under normal conditions, unless someone bypassed the process. I changed the status from verified to unverified change. 1 click, no alerts, no visible disruption. Just a silent shift in how the system would interpret the document moving forward. Hidden control isn't about stopping something, it's about letting it continue correctly. I leaned back, hands still, eyes on the screen for a few seconds longer. There was nothing else to do. No dramatic action. No confrontation waiting to happen. Just alignment. I logged out. Across the building through a glass wall I didn't need to see through, Dylan was still in that chair. Still holding the pen, still playing the role he thought he had earned. I didn't go back. By the time I reached the elevator, my access badge still worked. By the time I stepped outside, the system was still running. By the time the doors closed behind me, everything was exactly where it needed to be, because I hadn't stopped the deal. I had returned it to its actual state, unverified, unprotected, exposed to whatever came next. And Dylan, confident, unchallenged, unaware, did exactly what people like him always do when no one corrects them. He continued. Somewhere above me in that same room, he signed the contract. Not as a presenter, not as a witness, but as an authorized signatory, without authority, without validation, without understanding. I didn't need to see it happen. I already knew the sequence. The system doesn't react to intention. It reacts to conditions. And those conditions had just been met. Minutes later, while I was already outside, already removed from the building, already no longer part of the structure I had built, the back end registered the change. Not loudly, not publicly. Just a single internal line, recorded exactly as designed, unauthorized modification flagged. That was the moment control shifted. Not to me. To the system. 2 hours after I walked out, the first crack appeared, and like most cracks, it started small enough for them to ignore. I was sitting in my car when my phone buzzed. Not a call. An alert. External correspondence flagged by the same compliance filters I had spent years refining. Even without opening it, I knew the source. The partner. I waited a moment before checking. Timing matters more when you're no longer inside the room. The message was concise, professionally restrained, but unmistakable in tone, a request for immediate clarification regarding discrepancies in the executed agreement. Language like that doesn't come from confusion. It comes from detection. They had seen something. Inside the building, I could already imagine the shift in atmosphere. Confusion first. Quiet, controlled, almost polite. What discrepancy someone would ask. Dylan, probably still relaxed, still leaning back, would wave it off. It's fine. Standard legal noise. And Tucker Brantley, CEO, who had just handed over control, would nod, because acknowledging a problem that early would mean questioning his own decision. Denial isn't loud, it's convenient. 20 minutes later, the second signal hit. The escrow account. $35 million held in conditional release, suddenly locked pending review. Not withdrawn, not lost, just frozen. Exactly as designed when a contract fails validation checkpoints. That wasn't a glitch, that was procedure. I refreshed my screen, watching the internal system logs update in real time through the limited visibility still tied to my credentials. Each line appeared clean, neutral, unemotional. Escrow status, on hold. Trigger condition, contract validation failure. Action, automatic compliance review initiated. Upstairs, the tone would have changed by now. Confusion doesn't survive numbers. Dylan's voice sharper this time. Why is the money not moving? Someone from finance, responding carefully. It's flagged. We're checking. Tucker stepping in, controlled but irritated. Fix it. It's probably a system delay. Because it had to be. Admitting anything else would mean accepting that the system was doing exactly what it was built to do. And that would mean accepting that the problem wasn't the system. It was the decision. Another notification pulled my attention. Not internal this time. Social media. Dylan had posted. A clean shot of the contract on the table, his signature visible, captioned, with a kind of confidence only possible when consequences are still theoretical. Closed my first $140 million deal, I stared at it for a second longer than necessary. Not because it surprised me. Because it confirmed everything. Escalation doesn't require force. It just needs momentum. Back inside, the pressure would now be layered. External inquiry, financial interruption, public exposure, each one small on its own. Together, undeniable. I could picture the room tightening. Tucker's tone shifting from calm to controlled urgency. Get legal on this. Papers moving, screens lighting up. Someone finally reading the contract closely instead of assuming it was correct. And then, inevitably, the pause. Legal teams don't panic. They isolate. A senior attorney, likely quiet until that moment, scrolling back through the executed document. Noticing the change. Noticing the signature line. Noticing the name. Dylan Brantley. There's always a second of silence before understanding settles. Who authorized this, they would ask. Not accusatory. Not yet. Just precise. Because authority isn't implied in contracts like that. It's defined. Registered. Verifiable. And Dylan wasn't on that list. I watched the logs refresh again. Internal review expanding. Access trails being pulled. Version histories opening. Everything clean. Everything traceable. No ambiguity. Upstairs, denial would be harder to maintain now. It's a formality, Dylan might say, trying to hold on to control. I represent the company. But representation isn't authority. And systems like this don't recognize confidence. They recognize structure. Another update appeared on my screen. Legal status signature validation failed. Reason unauthorized signatory. That was the moment the crack stopped being small. It didn't shatter yet, but it spread. Quietly, precisely, irreversibly. If you think Dylan's careless move is about to cost him everything, drop a 1 in the comments. Sometimes the loudest confidence leads to the fastest collapse. By the time compliance stepped in, the room was no longer pretending everything was under control. Tension doesn't arrive all at once. It builds in layers, emails, unanswered numbers, that stop moving voices, that lower instead of rise. From the outside, it probably still looked manageable. Inside, the system had already made its decision. I wasn't there to watch it unfold, but I didn't need to be. The structure I had built was predictable under pressure. It didn't improvise. It followed sequence. First, the internal audit flag escalated from a passive alert to an active investigation. That alone shifted authority. Once compliance takes over, no executive title overrides process. Not even Tucker Brantley's. Second access logs were pulled. Every change to the contract, timestamped, attributed, verified, was laid out in a clean chronological line. Dylan's edits didn't blend in. They stood out, not because they were complex, but because they bypassed every expected checkpoint. Unauthorized modification, unverified version, invalid approval chain. None of it required interpretation. The system had already categorized the behavior. Exposure is rarely dramatic. It's clinical. Somewhere in that room, someone would have asked the question that matters most in situations like this. Who made these changes? There are only two possible answers in a system like that. Either no one knows or everyone does. And this time, everyone did. Dylan Brantley. His name would appear not just once, but repeatedly attached to edits, to timestamps, to the final signature. Clean. Undeniable. I imagined the moment they showed him. Not aggressively, not accusingly. Just a screen turned slightly in his direction. This is your activity. A pause. Then his response, predictable in its simplicity. It's not that serious. Confidence without context. That was always the pattern. Compliance doesn't react to tone, it reacts to thresholds. And Dylan had crossed several. The contract had been altered without authorization. The signature had been applied by someone not registered as an approved signatory, and now, layered on top of everything else, there was external exposure. The video. Even if he had intended it to be private systems, don't measure intent-only impact. The fact that contract details were visible, that identifiable elements of the agreement had been shared was enough. Information leakage. That classification alone was sufficient to escalate the case beyond internal handling. I could see how the conversation would shift. No longer about fixing a delay. No longer about moving funds. Now it was about containment. Shut down external access, notify legal, prepare incident report, each instruction tightening the structure around them. Tucker would try to regain control at that point. He always did. This is being overblown, he would say, voice measured but strained. We can resolve this internally. But compliance doesn't negotiate with preference. It follows protocol. And protocol had already moved past internal resolution. I refreshed my screen again, watching as the investigation status updated. Active review to escalated review. That transition meant one thing: irreversibility. Once escalated findings don't get buried. They get documented, reported, distributed to parties that don't benefit from minimizing them. The system was no longer protecting the company from risk. It was protecting itself from liability. That distinction matters. Because once that shift happens, the objective changes. Not fix the deal, but establish accountability. And accountability in this case had a name. I leaned back slightly, letting the sequence finish in my head. Dylan insisting it wasn't serious. Legal identifying the scope of exposure. Compliance expanding the review. Tucker realizing too late that control had already moved outside his reach. The deal itself was no longer the central issue. The process was. And processes don't bend for confidence money or family. They conclude. My phone buzzed again, softer this time. Not an alert. Not a system notification. An email. External. I opened it. The sender was the partner, the same one who had flagged the discrepancy earlier. The message was brief, direct, and completely aligned with what I had expected from the beginning. We've reviewed the situation. Given the compliance concerns and recent developments, we would prefer to continue discussions directly with you. No emotion, no accusation, just a shift. From them to me. I read it once, then again, not because I needed to understand it, but because I appreciated the precision. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. It didn't punish. It clarified. And once everything was clear, the outcome followed on its own. Panic doesn't announce itself. It leaks through the edges of control, one decision at a time, until the entire structure starts to shake. By the next morning, the chain reaction was no longer contained to a single deal. It had spread quietly at first, then all at once. The first signal came from a client I recognized immediately. A long-term partner, conservative, risk-sensitive, the kind that doesn't pause operations unless something feels fundamentally wrong. They didn't terminate. They suspended. Pending internal review, the notice said. Within an hour, 2 more followed. 3 major clients, all paused, all citing compliance concerns. That wasn't coincidence. That was pattern recognition. Inside the company, I could imagine the shift from controlled urgency to visible panic. Systems that once ran in parallel were now colliding legal finance compliance operations, all trying to stabilize a situation that no longer had a single point of failure. Because it wasn't just the deal anymore, it was trust. And trust once flagged doesn't degrade slowly. It drops. The internal audit expanded next. What began as a focused review of one contract widened into a broader assessment of process integrity. That's standard procedure when a breach suggests structural weakness. You don't just fix the surface, you test the entire system. Access logs were pulled across departments. Approval chains reviewed. Previous contracts re-examined for similar anomalies. Not because they expected to find more, but because they couldn't afford not to. System instability isn't chaos. It's overcorrection. Every safeguard activates at once. Every question becomes urgent. Every answer becomes insufficient. Somewhere in the middle of that escalation, the board stepped in. They always do when the numbers start to reflect the risk. An emergency request. Full report. Immediate. Not a summary, not a reassurance, documentation. That's when pressure stops being internal. Because once the board is involved, the narrative shifts from what happened to who is responsible. And responsibility in a structure like that needs a direction. Tucker Brantley found one. Me. I didn't hear it directly, but I didn't need to. I knew the logic. It's always the same. She designed the system. She handled the contract. She left right before the issue surfaced. A clean line. Easy to present. Easier to believe if no one looks closely. Blame, when applied, quickly feels like control. For a moment, it probably worked. It gave the room something to focus on that wasn't the current instability. It created distance between the decision and the consequence. But systems don't respond to narratives. They respond to data. And data doesn't care who tells the story. By midday, compliance had already moved beyond initial findings. The logs were no longer being reviewed. They were being compiled, structured, cross-referenced, prepared for reporting. That's when the shift happens. From investigation to conclusion. I refreshed the limited access view I still had. The window was closing, but not yet closed. The logs were clean. Every action tied to Dylan. Every modification time-stamped after my resignation. Every approval chain broken exactly where it had been altered. No ambiguity, no overlap, and most importantly, no activity from me after the moment I left. I watched as the final verification line appeared. User access status terminated. Timestamp prior to unauthorized modification. That was the detail that mattered. Because it didn't just remove me from the action, it removed me from the possibility. Back inside the room would have shifted again. The narrative Tucker had tried to build, controlled directional, would start to collapse under its own weight. Someone from compliance, likely calm, likely precise, presenting the finding without emphasis. She no longer had system access at the time of the incident. No accusation, just fact. And facts, when placed correctly, don't need force. They realign everything around them. I could imagine the silence that followed. Not confusion this time, recognition. Because once that line is established, the structure has no flexibility left. The cause is isolated, the responsibility is fixed, and control, whatever remained of it, moves away from the people who thought they had it. Loss of control doesn't feel like an explosion. It feels like something slipping slowly, at first, then completely. Tucker wouldn't be able to redirect it again. Not with data that clean. Not with a system that precise. Not with a sequence already locked into place. And somewhere in that room, whether anyone said it out loud or not, the realization would settle in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't something they could spin. This was a chain reaction, and it had already moved past the point where anyone could stop it. Clarity doesn't arrive as relief. It arrives as alignment, quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore. By the time the internal findings settled into formal reports, the structure I had built was no longer invisible. It was being studied, referenced, and more importantly, relied on. For years, compliance had been treated as a background function, necessary, but rarely understood. Now it was the only thing holding the situation together. That was the first shift. Not in authority, in recognition. Every safeguard, every validation layer, every conditional trigger embedded into the system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. It wasn't reacting to personalities or decisions. It was responding to conditions objective, measurable, consistent. Unauthorized modification, invalid signature, information exposure. Each one activated a separate mechanism. Together, they formed a closed loop that didn't require interpretation. It simply moved forward. I had built that loop, not as a defense against mistakes, but as a structure that assumed mistakes would happen and contained them when they did. That distinction mattered now, because the company wasn't collapsing from chaos. It was being contained by design. And containment has a cost. Externally, the impact was already visible. The partner had shifted from requesting clarification to reassessing engagement. Their language had changed, less cooperative, more measured. Trust once questioned doesn't return through explanation. It requires stability. And stability at that moment wasn't something the company could demonstrate. Not with 3 suspended clients. Not with an active compliance escalation. Not with a board demanding accountability. I didn't need internal access anymore to understand what was happening. The pattern was clear. When systems hold but people fail, external parties don't stay to observe. They reposition. That was the second shift. From internal crisis to external opportunity. I opened the partner's previous message again, reading it with a different perspective now. It wasn't just a request for clarification. It was an assessment of control. Who understood the system? Who could operate within it without triggering it? Who could ensure continuity without introducing risk? Those questions don't get asked directly. They get answered through behavior, and behavior in this case had been consistent. I had built the framework, I had validated the structure, and I had left before the deviation occurred. That sequence wasn't emotional. It was strategic. Power doesn't need to be claimed when it's already evident. By mid-afternoon, the signals aligned. Another message came in from the partner, shorter this time, more direct. The tone had shifted again, but not toward urgency, toward decision. They acknowledged the compliance issues, formally noted the disruption to the agreement, and then moved to the part that mattered. Continuity. They needed a way forward that didn't reintroduce the same risks. And in their assessment, that path no longer ran through the company. It ran through the system. More specifically, the person who understood it. I leaned back slightly, letting that settle. Strategic advantage isn't created in the moment of crisis. It's revealed there. For 14 years, I had operated in a position that required precision without visibility. I had built processes that functioned independently of recognition, designed to protect outcomes rather than credit. Now, for the first time, the visibility matched the value. The partner wasn't asking for explanations anymore. They were evaluating alternatives. And alternatives, when chosen carefully, don't look like replacements. They look like corrections. The final message confirmed it. They were considering restructuring the engagement, removing the company from the central role, and continuing discussions directly with me in an independent advisory capacity. Not immediately, not publicly, but actively. That was the third shift. From observation to transition. I closed the message and sat with the silence for a moment. No urgency, no reaction, just clarity, because the system had done exactly what it was built to do. It exposed weakness, it contained risk, and then, without force, it redirected value to where it could be sustained. Not back to the company. Forward. To me. The board doesn't convene unless control has already slipped beyond recovery. When they called the emergency session, it wasn't to ask what went wrong. It was to establish who allowed it to happen. I wasn't in the room, but I knew exactly how it would unfold. Boardrooms don't operate on emotion. They operate on sequence evidence, first interpretation, second accountability last. And once that sequence begins, it doesn't reverse. The meeting opened with formality, brief, controlled, the kind of tone executives use when they're still pretending outcomes can be managed. Tucker Brantley would have taken the head of the table, posture steady voice, measured, as if authority alone could stabilize what was already unraveling. Then legal spoke. They always do. No preamble, no reassurance. Just presentation. The first item, the live stream. A clip likely pulled and preserved within hours of posting. Dylan's voice casual, amused, completely unaware of consequence. The contract visible in the background terms, figures identifiable elements that were never meant to leave a controlled environment. Not speculation. Evidence. A pause would follow. Not long. Just enough for the room to absorb the shift from assumption to fact. Then the second item. Signature validation. The executed agreement displayed side by side with the authorized signatory registry. One column fixed, the other not. Dylan Brantley. A name that didn't belong in that space. No interpretation required. Signature applied without authority, legal would state tone even almost indifferent. Because for them, it wasn't personal, it was structural. The third item came last. Contract modification. Version history opened. Edits highlighted. A single line removed the one designed to enforce compliance validation under altered conditions. Time-stamped. Attributed. Irrefutable. Exposure doesn't need volume, it needs clarity. At that point, the room would shift, not dramatically. Boardrooms rarely do. But something subtle changes when all variables align in the same direction. Conversations shorten, questions become sharper. Silence carries more weight. Tucker would try to intervene then. He had to. This was a procedural oversight, he might say, leaning forward voice, controlled, but tighter now. We can correct this. The deal is still recoverable, but recovery requires leverage, and leverage requires credibility. Both were already compromised. One of the board members, someone experienced enough to recognize patterns, not just events, would ask the next question. Not about Dylan. Not about the contract. About the system. Who designed the compliance structure for this deal? The answer would come quickly. Calla Price. A brief acknowledgement. A note, not a conclusion. Then Tucker trying to redirect. She's no longer with the company. Which in any other context might have been enough. But not this one. Because absence in a system failure doesn't remove responsibility. It highlights it. The same board member would lean back slightly, reviewing the timeline, not just the events, but their order. Replacement, modification, escalation, sequence matters. And when sequence is clear, causality follows. That's when the question landed. Not raised, placed. Why was Calla removed from the deal? No accusation, no emotion, just precision. And in that moment, the fracture began. Because there are questions you can answer with confidence, and there are questions that expose the absence of it. This was the latter. Tucker wouldn't respond immediately. He couldn't. Any answer he gave would either justify the decision or admit it lacked justification. Neither option restored control. The room would go still, not uncertain. Resolved. Because once that question exists, everything before it reorganizes around it. The live stream becomes more than carelessness. The invalid signature becomes more than error. The contract modification becomes more than oversight. They become consequences. And consequences, when aligned with a decision, define it. From that point forward, the discussion would no longer center on fixing the deal. It would center on the decision that made fixing it necessary. Fracture doesn't sound like collapse. It sounds like silence, followed by recognition. And in that recognition, the structure of authority shifts not visibly, not immediately, but permanently. Because once the board stops asking what happened and starts asking why it was allowed, the outcome is no longer in question. Desperation changes how people sound before it changes what they say. It sharpens the edges, raises the volume, and strips away the confidence they relied on just moments before. By the time Dylan tried to speak again, the room had already moved past him. I wasn't there, but I knew the rhythm of collapse. It follows a pattern. First comes the attempt to regain control, then the instinct to redirect blame, and finally, when neither works, the realization that nothing left can be adjusted. Dylan started with denial. She sabotaged this. The words would come out quickly, almost reflexively, as if naming me could reintroduce uncertainty into a situation that had already been defined. It was the only narrative left available to him. If the system was precise, and it was then the only way to challenge it, was to question the person behind it. For a brief second, that might have created hesitation. Not belief, just pause. Because sabotage implies access. It implies interference. It suggests that something unseen had altered the outcome after the fact. But compliance doesn't operate on implication. It operates on logs. And logs don't hesitate. Someone from the compliance team would respond not emotionally, not defensively, just by shifting the conversation back to data. A screen turned a timeline, displayed each action aligned in exact order. Every modification to the contract is recorded here, they would say, voice steady. Timestamp. User ID. Action type. Dylan Brantley. Again and again. Scroll. Edit applied. Scroll. Clause removed. Scroll. Signature executed. No gaps. No anomalies. No evidence of external interference. Just sequence. That's what makes denial fragile in structured systems. It requires uncertainty to survive, and there wasn't any left. Dylan would try again this time, louder, pushing against the clarity instead of working within it. She had access. She built this system. She knew how to manipulate it. It sounded stronger, more deliberate, but the argument had already been neutralized before he finished it, because access is not assumed, it's recorded. Another line on the screen. User access status terminated. Timestamp prior to all unauthorized actions. That was the moment denial lost its foundation. No overlap. No possibility. No space left for interpretation. Silence would follow, but not the kind that invites reconsideration. The kind that confirms conclusion. Desperation doesn't end immediately after denial fails. It shifts. From explanation to defense. From defense to urgency. Dylan's posture would change, leaning forward now, voice tighter, trying to reclaim authority through insistence. This is being blown out of proportion. We can fix this. Just reverse the changes, release the funds, move forward. But systems like that don't reverse. They record. And once recorded, the process continues. At that point, someone would introduce the final piece. Not internal. External. The post. Displayed without commentary. His own words. Closed my first $140 million deal, the image attached. The contract visible. The signature clear. That wasn't interpretation. That was confirmation. Because while internal logs establish sequence external actions, establish intent. Together they remove doubt. Collapse doesn't happen in a single moment. It completes itself. Dylan would look at the screen, then back at the room, searching for something that no longer existed. Support, agreement, interruption. Anything that might slow what had already been decided. But no one moved. Because once evidence aligns across systems, internal and external, the outcome is no longer negotiable. Compliance wouldn't raise their voice. They wouldn't need to. They would simply close the loop. Based on the findings, all actions originate from your account. There is no indication of external manipulation. Clear, final. Then the procedural step that follows every confirmed breach at that level. Suspension. Not discussed. Not debated. Executed. Effective immediately. The words would be delivered the same way everything else had been measured, controlled, irreversible. Dylan Brantley is suspended pending further investigation. That was the end of his argument. Not because he stopped speaking, but because nothing he said after that could change the structure already in place. Desperation fades quickly when it has nowhere to land. And what remains isn't anger, or even disbelief, just the quiet realization that the system didn't fail. It worked exactly as intended. And this time, it worked on him. Pressure doesn't break people immediately. It narrows their options until every move carries consequence, and by the time they realize it, there's nothing left to choose. By the afternoon of the board review, Tucker Brantley was no longer managing a situation. He was being measured by it. The investigation had shifted from a single incident to a broader assessment of executive conduct. That's how it works when compliance identifies a structural failure tied to decision-making. It doesn't stop at the event. It traces the authority behind it. Nepotism isn't a policy violation on its own, but when it intersects with financial loss compliance breaches and governance failure, it becomes evidence. The board understood that, which meant Tucker's decision to replace me was no longer just questionable. It was central. They didn't accuse him directly. They didn't need to. Instead, they reconstructed the sequence in front of him: the removal, the unauthorized changes, the failed validation, the escalation. Each step connected, each step traceable. And at the center of that sequence was a single executive decision: his. Accountability in a boardroom doesn't sound like confrontation. It sounds like controlled inquiry. Walk us through your rationale. That's the question they ask when the answer has already been evaluated. Tucker would begin with confidence, or what remained of it. He would frame the decision as strategic leadership development exposure, succession planning, language designed to elevate the choice beyond its immediate consequences. But structure doesn't respond to language. It responds to outcome, and the outcome was already documented. 3 clients paused. $35 million in escrow frozen. Active compliance escalation. Potential regulatory exposure. Each number placed carefully in the conversation, not as accusation, but as context. Because context removes ambiguity. At some point, the tone would shift. Not louder, sharper. Were you aware of your nephew's prior compliance incident? That question matters. Not because of the answer, because of what it implies. Tucker would pause, just long enough for the room to register it. Yes, he might say. But it was resolved. Resolved isn't the same as irrelevant, and the board knows the difference. That's when authority begins to fracture. Not visibly, not immediately, but structurally. Because once prior knowledge is established, the decision stops being an oversight. It becomes a risk taken with awareness, and risk when realized becomes responsibility. From there, the outcome follows process. Restrictions, temporary at first. Operational authority limited. Decision-making oversight introduced, not a removal, a reduction. Because authority doesn't disappear all at once, it gets redistributed. The company, meanwhile, was already absorbing the external impact. Legal exposure assessments were underway. Regulatory counsel brought in. Financial forecasts adjusted to account for suspended revenue and potential penalties. This wasn't about optics anymore. It was about containment. And containment requires distance from the source of risk. That source had a name. I watched the updates come through in fragments, internal signals, external responses, patterns, aligning exactly as they should under pressure. No surprises, just progression. And then, in the middle of that controlled collapse, something shifted. My phone rang. Not an unknown number, not external. Him, Tucker Brantley. For a moment, I let it ring, not out of hesitation, out of clarity. Then I answered. He didn't speak immediately. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Because Tucker was never silent, not in meetings, not in negotiations, not when control was still within reach. When he finally spoke, the change wasn't in what he said. It was in how he said it. Kala. A pause. Measured, unsteady. We need to talk. No authority, no framing, no attempt to position the conversation. Just need. Pressure had done what argument couldn't. It had removed the distance between decision and consequence. And for the first time since I had known him, Tucker Brantley didn't sound like the CEO of anything. He sounded like someone who had run out of control. And realized it too late. Calm power doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly without urgency because it no longer needs permission to act. I let Tucker's words sit in the air for a moment before responding. Not to create tension, there was already enough of that, but to acknowledge what had changed. The distance between us wasn't personal anymore. It was structural. "I'm not coming back," I said. There was no hesitation in my voice. No anger, no satisfaction, just clarity. On the other end, silence stretched a second too long. He tried to recover shifting tone, searching for leverage that wasn't there anymore. "We can fix this," Tucker said. "I'll reinstate your position. Full control over the deal, whatever you need." That was the language he understood. Compensation, authority, restoration. But restoration implies something is still intact. This wasn't. "You already made your decision," I replied. "Now the system is making its own." Another pause, longer this time, because he understood what that meant. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a conclusion. I ended the call without waiting for a response. Not out of disrespect, but because there was nothing left to resolve on that side. The structure had already shifted, and I had moved with it. The partner reached out again within the hour this time, through a direct channel, no intermediaries, no formal layers, just a clear proposal. They didn't reference the company. They didn't need to. They referenced continuity. "We'd like to explore working with you independently." The phrasing was careful, but the intent was direct. They weren't asking for insight. They were asking for control. I reviewed the terms they outlined. Advisory role. Full oversight of compliance and deal architecture. Compensation aligned not with a salary, but with outcome percentages tied to execution, not position. It was everything my previous role had required, without the limitation of hierarchy. Justice doesn't feel like victory. It feels like alignment. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I was unsure, but because I was deliberate. Decisions at that level don't come from reaction. They come from understanding exactly where leverage sits. And for the first time, it sat entirely with me. I accepted. The agreement was formalized within 48 hours. Clean, direct, efficient. No excess language. No unnecessary structure. Just a framework built on clarity and mutual interest. My role didn't need a title anymore. It had function. And with function came control. Financially, the shift was immediate. The compensation model alone exceeded what I had earned in a year multiplied by outcome rather than constrained by salary. But the numbers weren't the point. The independence was. No internal politics, no diluted authority, no decisions overridden by someone who didn't understand the system they were touching, just execution. From the outside, the transition looked quiet. No announcement, no public statement. But inside the structures that mattered, the networks, the partnerships, the flow of decisions, it was visible. Because continuity had moved. And when continuity moves, value follows. A few days later, the final confirmation came through. Not to me, but to them. The company. The partner had formally withdrawn from the agreement. No renegotiation. No delay. Termination. Strategic relationships don't dissolve abruptly without reason. They realign when trust shifts beyond recovery. That's what had happened. The company didn't just lose the deal, they lost the client. One of their largest, one of their most stable, one of the few that had remained consistent through years of expansion. And now that relationship existed somewhere else. Not under their structure, under mine. Control doesn't always come from holding on to something. Sometimes it comes from letting the right things leave, and knowing exactly where they're going to land. Closure doesn't arrive with noise. It settles quietly, like a system returning to equilibrium after absorbing a shock. By the time the final report was issued, there was nothing left to argue. No alternative narrative, no room for interpretation. Just a sequence of decisions, actions, and outcomes aligned in a way that no one could deny. I read the summary once then again, not because it was complex, but because it was exact. Executive negligence caused systemic failure. No names in that sentence. They weren't necessary. Everyone knew who it pointed to. Tucker Brantley didn't resign publicly. There was no announcement, no statement framed for optics. But inside the structure that mattered, his authority was gone. Access reduced, decision rights reassigned. The title remained for a short time, but the function had already disappeared. That's how real removal works. Not dramatic. Final. Dylan was easier. His account activity stopped first. No new logins, no edits, no presence in any system that required accountability. Within days, his credentials were fully deactivated. His name remained in the audit trail, but only as a reference point, a fixed marker tied to a specific sequence of failure. Systems don't erase history, they preserve it. Because history, when recorded, properly prevents repetition. I didn't follow the internal conversations after that. I didn't need to. The outcome had already been defined long before the final report was written. Compliance doesn't create consequences. It confirms them. And once confirmed, they don't reverse. What remained wasn't anger, or even satisfaction, just clarity. 14 years of work reduced to a single decision by someone who believed structure could be replaced by proximity. That belief didn't just remove me. It removed the layer that had been holding everything together. Not visibly, but critically. That's the part most people miss. Systems don't fail because they're weak. They fail because someone removes the element that makes them stable. I stepped outside that structure before it collapsed, not because I anticipated the exact sequence, but because I understood the limits of what it could tolerate. That understanding wasn't emotional. It was built over time, through patterns, through failures I had prevented, through conditions I had designed the system to recognize. And when those conditions were met, the system responded, exactly as intended. I continued working, but not within the same framework. The partnership I had accepted moved forward without friction. Decisions were direct. Processes were respected. The same architecture I had built before now operated without interference. It didn't feel different. It felt correct. There was no need to revisit what had happened, no reason to reconstruct conversations or replay moments of tension. Those details belonged to a structure that no longer involved me. Closure isn't about revisiting the past. It's about recognizing that it no longer has influence over the present. One afternoon, I reviewed the final archived version of the contract, the one that had triggered everything. The same line Dylan had crossed out was still visible in the history, preserved exactly as it had been before the modification. A single line, easy to ignore, impossible to replace. I closed the file without saving anything. There was nothing left to adjust, no correction needed, just a complete sequence finished exactly where it was supposed to. I didn't feel vindicated, I felt certain. Because in the end, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about being right. It was about structure meeting reality. And reality doesn't negotiate, it aligns. I stood up, stepped away from the screen, and let the quiet settle in fully. No urgency, no tension, just resolution. Because what happened was never personal, it was systemic. And systems, when designed correctly, don't protect people from consequences. They deliver them. Precisely, they didn't replace me. They removed the only safeguard they had. I didn't walk away with anger, I walked away with clarity. What this taught me is that real value isn't in titles or recognition, but in the systems you build and the standards you refuse to lower. People can ignore you, replace you, even underestimate you, but they can't escape the consequences of removing what truly holds things together. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight louder, but to stand still and let the truth unfold on its own. I know how it feels to be overlooked, to give everything and still be treated like you're optional. But you're not. If you build something real, something grounded in integrity and precision, it will speak for you when it matters most. If this story meant something to you, don't just scroll past it. Your comment, your subscription, they're not small actions. They help this message reach someone else who might be going through the same thing, someone who needs that one moment of clarity to change their path. So if you've ever been underestimated, this is your moment to stand for something. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.